She was young, capable, and far too determined to let any man intimidate her. He was respected, feared, and used to being in control at all times. In theory, the two of them should never have gotten involved for even a second. In practice, one disastrous first encounter was all it took for the universe to decide that watching these two go to war would be far too entertaining. The suitcase weighed more than it should, not because of the books or the clothes or the diploma tucked carefully between two sweaters. It weighed more because it carried 6 years of a life built far from home, early mornings in foreign libraries, dinners alone in a tiny flat, exams written in a language that still visited her dreams with an accent. Grace Young was 24 years old, and she was finally coming home. The car her cousin Oliver sent was already waiting outside the airport. She slid into the back seat, kicked off her shoes, and pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the window. England looked exactly the same. The grey sky, the hedgerows blurring past, the particular shade of green that only existed in this corner of the world. She had missed it like a phantom limb. Her phone buzzed. "If you're not on this yacht in 2 hours, I'm telling Aunt Margaret you have a boyfriend." She laughed out loud. Oliver. Her cousin, her chaos, her favorite person in a family that could fill a small stadium. He was turning 30, and the celebration was exactly his style. A weekend aboard the Ether, the super yacht he had bought 3 years ago when his tech company went public. The whole family would be there. Aunts, uncles, cousins she hadn't seen since they were all sunburned teenagers fighting over the last slice of cake. Grace texted back, "I'll be there. Don't you dare." She made it with 40 minutes to spare. The tender carried her from the marina to the yacht, and the moment she stepped on board, the noise hit her. Laughter, clinking glasses, a jazz quartet playing something smooth near the upper deck. Fairy lights hung in soft loops along the railings, the smell of salt water mixed with expensive cologne and roasted garlic from the galley below. Oliver spotted her before she spotted him. "There she is." He crossed the deck in 4 strides and lifted her off the ground in a hug that squeezed the air from her lungs. 6 years. 6 years, Gracie. You owe me approximately 400 missed Sunday dinners. If this story is touching your heart, show your support. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your friends. Every action helps us keep bringing you new stories full of emotion. Put me down before I sue you for assault. He set her down, grinning. His hair was shorter than she remembered, and there were new lines around his eyes, the kind that came from laughing too much, not worrying. He looked good. He looked grown up. "Come on," he said, throwing an arm around her shoulders. "Everyone's been asking when you'd show up." The next 2 hours were a blur of hugs and questions and glasses of champagne pressed into her hand. She danced with her cousins, argued with Uncle Richard about politics, and let Aunt Margaret inspect her face for signs of malnutrition. The jet lag crept in slowly at first, then all at once, like a wave pulling her ankles out from under her. She found Oliver near the bar. "I'm done," she said. "If I don't lie down in the next 10 minutes, I'm going to fall asleep on Aunt Margaret's shoulder and she'll try to adopt me again." Oliver waved her off. "Go. Your usual suite." The corridor was quiet. The bass from the music above hummed through the walls like a distant heartbeat. Grace found the door. Same one, same hallway, same brass handle she'd been turning since she was 16. She stepped inside without turning on the lights, peeled off her shoes, and headed straight for the bathroom. The shower was long and hot. She stood under the water until her shoulders unknotted, until the last 18 hours of airports and turbulence melted off her skin. Steam filled the small space, thick and warm, carrying the scent of eucalyptus from the soap she'd always loved. She stepped out. No robe on the hook, no towel within reach, except the small one she wrapped around her wet hair, twisting it up on top of her head. She walked into the bedroom completely bare, and stopped. A man stood in the doorway, tall, broad shoulders that filled the frame like they'd been measured for it. Dark hair, dark eyes, a jaw that could have been carved with a straight edge. He wore a white shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, and he was holding a glass of whiskey that he clearly forgot existed. His gaze dropped. Fast. Down the line of her neck, her collarbone, the curve of her waist. It lasted less than 2 seconds, but she felt it like a match dragged across her skin. She screamed. Not a full scream, a strangled, sharp sound that got caught in her throat as she lunged for the nearest towel and clutched it against her body. He slapped his hand over his eyes. The whiskey sloshed. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. This is my suite. They assigned it to... This is my suite." Her voice came out higher than she wanted. "I've had this room since I was 16. I believe you." His hand was still firmly over his face. His voice was low, slightly rough, and irritatingly steady for a man who had just seen a stranger naked. "But if you check the wardrobe, you'll find my luggage already in it." She looked, one hand gripping the towel, the other pulling the wardrobe door open. A leather bag, monogrammed, not hers. The floor tilted beneath her feet. I didn't check with the crew," she managed. "Clearly." He turned around, facing the corridor. "I'll go. Take your time." And he left. Just like that. No lingering, no clever remark. The door clicked shut behind him, and Grace stood alone in a room that suddenly felt enormous, pressing the towel against her chest so hard her knuckles ached. Her reflection stared back at her from the mirror across the room. Flushed cheeks, wide eyes, damp hair already escaping the twist. She closed her eyes and exhaled. Her heart hammered against her ribs like it was trying to escape. Embarrassment flooded her chest, hot and sharp. She wanted to melt into the carpet. She wanted to rewind the last 3 minutes and lock the door like any reasonable person would have done. But underneath the humiliation, something else stirred. Something heavy and warm that settled low in her stomach and refused to leave. Those dark eyes, the way they had moved over her body, not with intent, not with entitlement, but with a shock so raw it had stripped him as bare as she was. She shook her head. No, absolutely not. She got dressed, switched to the suite 2 doors down, and spent the rest of the night staring at the ceiling while the yacht rocked gently beneath her. Sleep didn't come for a long time. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his face, the sharp line of his jaw, the hand pressed over his eyes, the low rumble of his voice saying, "I'll go." Somewhere on the other side of the yacht, in the suite that smelled faintly of eucalyptus and something he couldn't name, Preston Lamberton sat on the edge of the bed with his elbows on his knees and his head in his hands. He hadn't moved in 20 minutes. He was a judge, a disciplined man, a man who controlled courtrooms and silenced barristers with a single look, and he could not, for the life of him, get the image of that woman out of his head. The coffee was terrible, burnt, bitter, and lukewarm, the kind only government buildings seemed capable of producing. Grace took another sip anyway, because her hands needed something to hold. The courthouse was older than she expected. Stone corridors that echoed with every footstep, dark wood paneling that smelled of furniture polish, and decades of whispered arguments. Portraits of former judges lined the hallway, leading to the chambers, stern faces in heavy frames, watching her pass like a row of disapproving grandfathers. She had dressed carefully. Black trousers, a fitted blazer the color of charcoal, a cream blouse with a collar that sat just right. Her hair was pulled back, low and neat, because she'd read somewhere that judges noticed everything and forgave nothing. Her new heels clicked against the marble floor with a rhythm that sounded more confident than she felt. The Honourable Justice Lamberton. That was the name on the brass plate beside the door, one of the most respected and feared judges in the region. Oliver had told her stories. A man who could dismantle a barrister's argument in 3 sentences, who ran his courtroom like a military operation, who had once made a senior solicitor cry by simply raising an eyebrow. Grace straightened her blazer. She had graduated top of her class in a foreign country, in a language that wasn't her first, surrounded by people who had every advantage she didn't. She had survived on instant noodles and library coffee, and sheer, stubborn refusal to fail. She could handle one judge. She knocked twice, firm, even knocks. "Come in." The voice was muffled through the heavy oak door, but something about it snagged in her memory like a thread catching on a nail. She turned the handle and stepped inside. The office was large. Bookshelves covered every wall, crammed with leather-bound volumes and stacked files. A wide mahogany desk dominated the center, and behind it, framed by the grey morning light pouring through tall windows, sat the man from the yacht. Her blood ran cold. Same shoulders, same jaw, same dark eyes that had traced a path down her body 3 nights ago while steam curled between them. He wore a black robe now. His hair was combed back, and his expression was the kind of blank that took years to perfect. But she saw it, the fraction of a second where his eyes widened, where recognition cracked through the surface like a stone hitting glass. Then it was gone. He stood. He extended his hand. "Miss Young, welcome to the chambers." His voice, low, measured, polished. The same voice that had said, "I'll go in a dark hallway on a yacht," except now it carried the weight of authority and the careful distance of a man who had decided, in the space between one heartbeat and the next, to pretend they had never met. She took his hand. His grip was firm and professional. His fingers were warm, and they lingered, 1 second longer than protocol required, 1 second that neither of them acknowledged out loud, but both of them felt in the center of their chests. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said. Her voice held steady. She was proud of that. He gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Sit." She sat. He returned to his seat and opened a file without looking at her. "You've been assigned as my legal assessor for the next term. I expect punctuality, precision, and absolute discretion regarding any case that passes through this office." He turned a page. "I do not tolerate errors. I do not repeat instructions. And I do not accept work that hasn't been reviewed at least twice before it reaches my desk." He spoke the way he probably ran everything, with the assumption that he would be obeyed. Grace folded her hands in her lap. "Understood." "Good." He finally looked up. His gaze was steady, dark, completely unreadable. "Do you have any questions?" 100. Starting with, "Did you know it was me when you requested the hire?" and ending with, "Do you always drink whiskey alone at parties?" "No questions," she said. "Then you may begin with these." He slid a stack of files across the desk. His fingertips brushed the wood with a precision that seemed deliberate, as if even the act of pushing paper required control. "I need annotations by end of day." She picked up the files and stood. At the door, she paused. Not because she had something to say, but because the pull of that room, the quiet weight of his presence, the smell of old books and something warm and woody that she now recognized as him, made leaving feel like stepping out of a current. She didn't turn around. She walked out, closed the door behind her, and made it to her desk at the end of the corridor before the air rushed back into her lungs. She sat down, opened the first file. The words blurred for a moment. 3 nights ago she had been naked in front of that man, and now he was her boss, the most powerful judge she had ever stood before, and he had seen her without a single stitch of clothing, dripping wet, with a towel on her head and terror in her eyes. She pressed her palms flat against the desk and stared at the wall. This was fine, completely, totally, absolutely fine. Behind the closed door of his chambers, Preston Lamberton had not moved since she left. The file in front of him was open to page 1. He had read the same paragraph 4 times. He could still feel the ghost of her hand in his, the brief pressure of her fingers, the coolness of her skin against his palm. He had spent 3 nights trying to forget the image of her on the yacht, the shock in her wide eyes, the way the light had caught the water still clinging to her collarbone, the sound of her voice going sharp with outrage, 3 nights of discipline and deliberate forgetting. All of it undone in the time it took her to walk through his door. He closed the file, opened it again. His secretary knocked. "Your Honor, the Morrison briefs are ready for... Leave them on the table." The door closed. Preston leaned back in his chair and pressed 2 fingers against the bridge of his nose. He was 41 years old. He had built a career on logic, restraint, and the ability to separate what he felt from what he did. She was his assessor, his colleague, his best friend's cousin. He picked up his pen and returned to the file. The paragraph still didn't make any sense. 2 weeks in, and Grace had learned the rhythm of his chambers like a musician learns a song. 8:15. Preston arrived. Always the same. Coat folded over his arm, briefcase in his left hand, a nod to the secretary that passed for a greeting. 8:20. The door to his office closed, and the sound of papers being sorted came through the wall in a crisp, methodical shuffle. 8:45. The first summons. Her phone would buzz with a single line. "Come in." And the day would begin. She was good at her job. She knew it, and more importantly, he knew it. In the first week, She'd caught a precedent error in a sentencing memo that would have embarrassed the entire chambers. She hadn't made a scene about it. She'd simply placed the corrected version on his desk with the relevant case law flagged in yellow. He had looked at it, looked at her, said nothing. But the next morning, the files waiting on her desk were thicker, more complex, the kind of work he usually reserved for senior staff. It was the closest thing to a compliment Preston Lamberton seemed capable of giving. They settled into a working pattern that was efficient, professional, and completely unbearable. Because the office was not large enough. It had seemed spacious on her first day, the wide desk, the bookshelves, the tall windows. But now every square foot felt charged, as if the air between them had developed its own pulse. She became aware of distances the way a sailor reads tides. 3 feet when she stood beside his desk, 5 feet when she sat in her usual chair, 1.5 feet when he leaned over to point something out in a document, his sleeve almost brushing her arm. On a Tuesday she made a mistake, not in the files, in the physics of the room. She needed to show him a paragraph buried deep in a contract. Page 47, Clause 9, subsection B. Instead of sliding the document across the desk, she stood, walked around to his side, and leaned over his shoulder to point at the line. Her perfume arrived before her finger touched the page. It was something light, jasmine maybe, or white tea. He couldn't place it, and that bothered him more than it should have. It filled the narrow space between them like smoke, quiet and impossible to ignore. His hand tightened around his pen. The knuckles went pale. "Here," she said, her finger tracing the line. "The liability clause contradicts the indemnity on page 12. If opposing counsel catches this, it unravels the entire—" "I see it." His voice came out, clipped, almost harsh. She glanced at him. He was staring at the page with the intensity of a man trying to read through solid wood. "Are you all right?" "Fine, go back to your desk." She straightened up slowly. If she noticed the way he exhaled the moment she stepped away, a long, controlled breath through his nose, like a man surfacing from deep water. She didn't show it. 3 days later, he returned the favor without meaning to. He had a habit of dictating notes while pacing, back and forth across the office, hands clasped behind his back, voice steady and precise, while she typed on the laptop balanced on her knees. She had grown used to the rhythm of his steps. 4 strides to the window, turn, 4 strides to the bookshelf, turn. But that afternoon, something in the argument he was building made him change direction. He pivoted mid-stride and stopped directly in front of her chair. Close. Too close. She looked up from the screen. Slowly. Past his belt, his chest, the open collar of his shirt where a single vein pulsed at the base of his throat. Their eyes met. He went still, completely dangerously still, like a man who had just realized he was standing at the edge of something, and the ground beneath him was no longer solid. 2 seconds. Then he turned away, crossed to the bookshelf, and pulled down a volume he absolutely did not need. "The Henderson ruling," he said, opening the book to a random page. 1994. His voice was steady. His hands were not. Grace returned her eyes to the screen and typed the last sentence he'd dictated. Her pulse was hammering in her wrists. She pressed her fingers flat against the keyboard until the trembling stopped. Neither of them mentioned it. They didn't need to. The room remembered for them. Then came the hearing. It was a high-profile case, commercial dispute, 3 barristers, a packed gallery. Grace had prepared the bench notes, cross-referenced every citation, and stayed until midnight the night before to make sure nothing was missing. She arrived at the courthouse early and changed in the staff room. The dress was black, fitted at the waist, with a neckline that sat just below her collarbone. Elegant, professional, and it followed the line of her body with a quiet precision that left nothing to the imagination and everything to it. She didn't wear it for him. At least that's what she told herself. Preston was in the corridor outside courtroom 3, speaking with a colleague about scheduling when she rounded the corner. Mid-sentence, his gaze caught on her and the words simply stopped. His colleague waited. Preston blinked, recovered, and finished his thought, but the pause had been there, visible as a crack in glass. Later, back in the chambers, he sat behind his desk, and she stood by the door waiting for instructions. "The hearing went well," she offered. "It did." He didn't look up. Then, almost as an afterthought, "You might want to review the dress code guidelines for tribunal appearances." Section 4 covers appropriate attire. She tilted her head. I'm familiar with Section 4. My attire is well within the guidelines. He said nothing. She smiled. Slowly. The kind of smile that starts at the corner of the mouth and takes its time reaching the eyes. Will that be all, Your Honor? He looked up. Whatever he saw in her face made something shift behind his eyes, something hot and restless that he locked away before it could reach the surface. That will be all. She left. The door clicked shut. Preston dropped his pen on the desk, leaned back and stared at the ceiling for a very long time. You look awful. Oliver said it the way only a cousin could, with love, no filter, and a chip halfway to his mouth. They were sitting in a booth at a pub near the marina, the kind of place with sticky tables and perfect fish and chips. Rain streaked the windows and blurred the boats outside into grey smudges. Grace stabbed a chip into her mushy peas. Thanks. Really helpful. I'm serious. You've got circles under your eyes, you've lost weight, and you just dipped a chip in peas, which means you're not paying attention to anything I'm saying. She looked down at her plate. He was right about the peas. It's just the job, she said. The caseload is heavy, and Lamberton doesn't exactly hand out gold stars for effort. Oliver leaned back and studied her with that particular look he had, the one that said he was reading the parts of her she hadn't meant to show. How's that going, by the way, working for my best mate? Your best mate is a tyrant. He's thorough. He made me rewrite a memo 4 times because the margin spacing was inconsistent. Oliver grinned. That sounds like him. He took a sip of his beer. But he's fair, Gracie, tough but fair. And the fact that he's piling work on you means he trusts your brain. Preston doesn't waste time on people he thinks can't keep up. She didn't answer right away. She was thinking about the way Preston had said, dress code, as if the words were made of something sharp, and the way his jaw had tightened when she smiled at him. She was thinking about the pen in his hand, and the white knuckles, and the breath he'd released when she stepped away from his desk. What's his favorite restaurant? She asked, and then immediately regretted it. Oliver raised an eyebrow. Why? No reason. He mentioned something about a place near the courthouse. I couldn't remember the name. It was a clumsy lie, and Oliver saw right through it, but he let it go the way he always let things go when he was storing ammunition for later. Marchetti's, he said. Little Italian place on King Street. He's been going there since law school. Orders the same thing every time, and grilled chicken, roasted vegetables, sparkling water. The man eats like a monk. Sounds about right. Oliver pointed a chip at her. And what about you? When's the last time you had a proper lunch that wasn't a granola bar at your desk? She didn't answer, which was answer enough. What Grace didn't know, what she wouldn't discover for another week, was that Oliver had this same conversation with Preston. Not word for word, but close enough. It happened on a Wednesday evening. Preston and Oliver met for their usual drinks at the club, a habit they'd kept since university. They sat in leather chairs by the fireplace, whiskey in hand, talking about nothing important until Oliver steered the conversation exactly where he wanted it. Grace is working herself into the ground, you know. Preston swirled his glass. She's dedicated. She's skipping meals. Something shifted in Preston's expression. A flicker, quick as a bird's shadow. She's an adult. She can manage her own schedule. She's 24 and stubborn as a mule. She gets so locked into a case that she forgets to eat, and then she runs on caffeine and willpower until she crashes. Oliver took a slow sip. I'm just saying, you're her boss. You could remind her. Preston said nothing. He drank his whiskey and changed the subject to the rugby scores, and Oliver let him because Oliver knew exactly what that silence meant. The next day, a paper bag appeared on Grace's desk at 12:30. She opened it. Inside, grilled chicken with roasted vegetables, a small salad, a bottle of sparkling water, and a warm bread roll wrapped in a cloth napkin. The food came from Marchetti's. She could tell by the logo on the bag and the smell of rosemary and olive oil that made her stomach growl so loudly the secretary in the next room looked up. There was no note, no explanation. She ate every bite. The next day, another bag. Same time, same place. This time it was pasta with a lemon sauce, a side of grilled courgette, and a small cup of tiramisu that was so good she almost made a sound that would have been inappropriate for a courthouse. Day 3. A risotto that tasted like someone had taken autumn and put it in a bowl. Day 4. She couldn't take it anymore. She knocked on his door, didn't wait for the invitation, walked in and set the empty bag on the corner of his desk. "Who's been ordering this?" Preston didn't look up from his file. "Ordering what?" "Lunch from Marchetti's every day this week on my desk, no note. I have no idea what you're talking about." She crossed her arms. "Marchetti's is your favorite restaurant, Oliver told me." A pause, almost imperceptible. His pen continued moving across the page. "Oliver talks too much. Preston." It was the first time she'd used his first name in the office. The word landed between them like a stone dropped into still water. He stopped writing, looked up. Those dark eyes, steady and unreadable, met hers with a calm that cost him more than she knew. "An assessor who skips meals doesn't think clearly," he said. "It affects the quality of the work. I'm protecting the efficiency of my chambers." She stared at him. He held her gaze. "That's your answer?" "That's my answer." She picked up the empty bag and turned toward the door. Halfway there, she paused. "The tiramisu was exceptional," she said without turning around. "Whoever ordered it has very good taste." She heard it, just barely. A sound that might have been a breath or might have been the beginning of a laugh that he caught before it escaped. She walked back to her desk, with warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the risotto. That evening, Preston sat in his office long after everyone else had gone. The courthouse was silent. Rain tapped against the windows in an uneven rhythm, and the desk lamp cast a pool of gold light across the files he should have been reading. He opened the Marchetti's app on his phone and scrolled through the menu. Tomorrow was Friday. She had mentioned once in passing to the secretary that she loved their mushroom soup. He placed the order, set his phone face down on the desk. Then he pulled the file toward him and tried, for the third time that evening, to focus on something other than the way his name had sounded in her voice. It didn't work. Rain had been falling since dawn, the kind of steady English rain that turned the world outside the courthouse windows into a watercolor painting. Soft edges, muted colors, the occasional blur of an umbrella moving through the car park below. Inside the chambers, the afternoon had gone quiet. The last hearing had ended early. The secretary had left for a dental appointment, and the corridor outside was empty. It was the kind of silence that made a room feel smaller, that pushed two people closer together, even when neither of them moved. Grace sat in the leather chair across from Preston's desk, a case file open on her lap. She had been reading the same witness statement for 20 minutes. It was a complicated fraud case, civil, not criminal, and the testimony had more holes than a fishing net. She was marking inconsistencies with a red pen, building the kind of analysis that Preston would review with his usual intensity, and, if she was lucky, approve without changes. She was concentrating, truly concentrating, and then she did it. It wasn't conscious. It was the thing she always did when her mind locked onto a problem. Her teeth found her lower lip and pressed down slowly, pulling it in, holding it while she thought. A small gesture, meaningless. Except that Preston was watching. He had been reviewing his own file, or trying to. But the silence had sharpened his awareness of her the way it always did when they were alone, and his gaze had drifted, first to her hand, turning the page, then to the way she tilted her head when she found something interesting, and finally, inevitably, to her mouth. She bit down again, slow, absent. The kind of gesture that would have meant nothing from anyone else but from her, in that light, in that silence. It landed somewhere in his chest, like a fist. "Stop doing that." His voice came out lower than he intended. Rougher. Grace looked up. Her eyes were wide, clear, entirely innocent. "Doing what?" He didn't answer, not with words. He stood. The chair rolled back behind him with a soft sound against the carpet. He walked around the desk, 3 steps, maybe 4, and stopped directly in front of her. She had to tilt her head back to look at him. The file slid an inch down her lap. She didn't catch it. He reached down. His thumb found her lower lip, still caught between her teeth, and pressed against it gently, not pulling, just resting there, warm and steady, until her jaw relaxed and her lips slipped free beneath his touch. He didn't move his hand. His thumb stayed against her mouth. The pad of it rested on the soft skin just below her lower lip, and she could feel the rough texture of his fingerprint, the faint tremor in his hand that he was fighting to control. His eyes were dark and fixed on hers, with an intensity that made the air between them feel like something solid, something she could lean into. Her breath caught. She could smell him. That warm, woody scent she had first noticed in the yacht suite, now mixed with ink and the faint bitterness of the coffee he drank black. It filled her lungs and stayed there, heavy and sweet. Neither of them moved. His jaw was tight. A muscle twitched near his ear. She could see the war behind his eyes. Discipline fighting against something older and stronger. Something that didn't care about courtrooms or professional boundaries, or the brass plate on the door that said, "Honorable." Her lips parted slightly beneath his thumb. She felt his breath change, felt his whole body shift forward by a fraction of an inch. 3 seconds. 3 seconds of absolute stillness, where the only sound was the rain against the window and the blood rushing in her ears. Then someone knocked on the door. The sound split the air like a gunshot. Preston pulled his hand back as if he'd touched a flame. He stepped away, 1 stride, 2, and by the time the door opened, he was standing by the bookshelf with his back to the room and a volume of case law in his hand that he was holding upside down. "Your Honor?" The clerk poked his head in. "The Morrison files you requested." "Leave them on the desk." Preston's voice was perfectly even. An extraordinary performance. The clerk set the files down, glanced at Grace, one who was staring at her case file with the focus of someone defusing a bomb, and left. The door closed. Silence. Grace's hands were shaking. She pressed them flat against the file and counted her breaths. 1, 2, 3. The place where his thumb had rested still tingled, a phantom warmth that wouldn't fade. She didn't look at him. If she looked at him, something would break. Some invisible wall they had both been pretending was made of stone would crumble, and neither of them was ready for what waited on the other side. "I should finish this analysis," she said. Her voice sounded distant, like it belonged to someone in another room. "Yes." He was still facing the bookshelf. "You should." She gathered the files, stood, and walked to the door. Her legs felt strange, steady enough to carry her, but only just. At the threshold, she stopped. She couldn't help it. "Preston." He turned his head, just enough to see her in his peripheral vision. "The book is upside down." She left before he could respond. Back at her desk, she set the files down and placed both hands flat on the surface. The wood was cool beneath her palms. Real, solid. She needed something real and solid because the rest of her felt like she was made of smoke. She touched her lip, right where his thumb had been. Something had changed. Not just the tension, not just the heat. Something deeper, something that had roots now. Something that had moved from her skin to somewhere beneath her ribs, where it couldn't be ignored or reasoned away. She picked up her pen and opened the file. The words meant nothing. The analysis could wait. All she could think about was 3 seconds of silence and the sound of rain. Down the corridor, behind a closed door, Preston Lamberton turned the book right side up and placed it carefully back on the shelf. He stood there for a long moment, one hand resting on the spine, his forehead almost touching the wood. He closed his eyes. The smell of jasmine was still in the room. The first time Victoria Hale walked into the chambers, she brought lilies. Not a bouquet. That would have been too obvious. A single stem, white, tucked elegantly into the outside pocket of her leather briefcase, as if it had landed there by accident. She was the kind of woman who made everything look accidental, and nothing ever was. Grace noticed her before Preston did, the click of expensive heels on marble, a perfume that arrived 3 steps ahead of the woman wearing it, something heavy and floral that colonized the corridor like an occupying army. Grace looked up from her desk just as Victoria swept past, all sharp cheekbones and tailored silk, her blonde hair cut in a bob so precise it looked architectural. She knocked on Preston's door without slowing down. "Justice Lamberton, I hope I'm not interrupting." Grace heard Preston's voice through the open door, measured, polite, the same tone he used with every visiting counsel. Nothing special, nothing warm. But Victoria stayed for 40 minutes. When she finally emerged, the lily was gone, left behind, presumably, on Preston's desk or his windowsill, a tiny flag planted in conquered territory. Victoria paused at Grace's desk on her way out and offered a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. "You must be the new assessor. Oliver's cousin, isn't that right? That's right. How lovely. Such a small world. Her eyes moved over Grace, a quick, thorough scan that catalogued everything from her shoes to her hairline. You're younger than I expected. Grace smiled back, the kind of smile she saved for people who were measuring her. I hear that a lot. Victoria's gaze lingered for half a second longer than necessary. Then she was gone, heels clicking a confident retreat down the marble corridor. Grace stared at the empty hallway and felt something cold settle beneath her ribs. It wasn't jealousy, not yet. It was recognition, the instinct of one strategist identifying another. Victoria came back 2 days later, then again on Friday. By the second week, her visits had a rhythm, a new case to discuss, a precedent to debate, a question that could have been answered with an email but apparently required 45 minutes of FaceTime and a smile that could have cut glass. Grace watched. She watched Victoria lean across the desk to point at a document the same way Grace had done weeks ago, but slower, more deliberate, her body angled so that the neckline of her blouse did most of the talking. She watched Victoria touch Preston's arm when she made a point, a casual brush of fingertips that lasted just long enough to register. She watched Victoria suggest lunch, purely professional, of course, with the kind of confidence that expected yes and had rarely heard no. Preston declined, every time. I have a full calendar, he said to the first invitation. I prefer to eat at my desk, he said to the second. Perhaps another time, he said to the third, and the perhaps was the politest form of never that Grace had ever heard. But Victoria didn't stop. She adjusted, recalibrated, found new angles. She began addressing Grace directly, asking about cases with a collegial warmth that was clearly designed to demonstrate how comfortable she was in these chambers, how naturally she belonged. Grace answered every question with professional precision and a face that gave away nothing. Inside, the cold thing beneath her ribs was growing teeth. She had no right to feel this way. She knew that. Preston wasn't hers. The moment in the office, the thumb, the lip, the 3 seconds, had never been named or acknowledged. They had spent the days since in careful, excruciating politeness, circling each other like two people walking the edge of the same cliff and pretending the drop didn't exist. But watching another woman reach for him, watching someone else try to close the distance that Grace had been holding open with white-knuckled restraint, made something inside her pull tight, like a wire about to snap. One afternoon, Victoria arrived while Grace was in the chambers delivering a file. Victoria swept in, all smiles and silk, and placed a hand on Preston's desk as she leaned forward to make a point about a ruling. I think you'll find the appellate court agreed with my reading, Victoria said, her voice smooth as poured cream. If you'd like, I could walk you through the brief over dinner. Preston's expression didn't change. Send it to my clerk. I'll review it. Victoria's smile thinned by a fraction. She straightened, turned, and seemed to notice Grace for the first time. Oh, I didn't see you there. Busy day. Always, Grace said. Their eyes met. Something passed between them that was older than language, a quiet ancient recognition between two women who understood exactly what was happening and would never, ever say it out loud. Victoria left. The chambers fell silent. Grace placed the file on the desk. The Crawford annotations, flagged and indexed. Thank you. She turned to go. Grace. She stopped. He almost never used her first name in the office. When he did, it changed the air. Victoria Hale is a respected counsel, he said. His voice was careful, as if he were choosing each word from a shelf. Her visits are strictly professional. Grace looked at him over her shoulder. Her face was calm, but her jaw was set in a way that he was learning to read like a warning. I didn't say anything. I know. He held her gaze. I wanted you to know anyway. A beat. 2. Noted, she said, and left. She sat at her desk and stared at the wall for a full minute. Her chest ached with something she refused to name because naming it would make it real, and real things could hurt, and she had built an entire life on the principle that nothing and no one would have the power to hurt her unless she allowed it. She picked up her pen. She did not allow it. But that night, alone in her flat, standing in the kitchen waiting for the kettle to boil, She pressed her fingers against her collarbone and thought about the way he had said, "I wanted you to know anyway." As if the words had been pulled out of him against his will, as if telling her was a concession he hadn't planned to make. The kettle clicked off. Steam rose and vanished. She poured the tea and didn't drink it. The invitation sat on Grace's desk for 3 days before she decided to go. The annual Legal Society Gala. Black tie, open bar, 300 lawyers and judges crammed into the grand ballroom of the Kensington Hotel. The kind of event where careers were made over champagne and ruined over whispered gossip. Grace had planned to skip it. She had a stack of case files that needed finishing, and a strong preference for spending Friday nights in pajamas with a cup of tea and a book she didn't have to annotate. But then the secretary mentioned casually that Victoria Hale had been asking whether Justice Lamberton would be attending. Grace RSVP'd that afternoon. She chose her outfit with the precision of a general planning a campaign. Not the black dress, too safe. Not the red, too loud. She settled on something in deep emerald green, fitted at the waist, with thin straps that left her shoulders bare, and a hemline that stopped just above the knee. Simple. Devastating. The kind of dress that whispered instead of shouted, and was more dangerous for it. She pinned her hair up loosely, letting a few dark strands fall around her face, and wore earrings her mother had given her, small gold drops that caught the light when she turned her head. She looked at herself in the mirror and saw a woman who looked older than 24, a woman who looked like she belonged in any room she chose to enter. Good. She would need that tonight. The ballroom was everything she expected. Crystal chandeliers, white tablecloths, the hum of expensive conversations layered over a string quartet playing something restrained and elegant. She spotted Oliver first, holding court near the bar with a group of tech investors, his bow tie already loosened. He caught her eye and raised his glass with a grin that said, "About time." She hadn't been there 5 minutes when a voice appeared at her shoulder. "You must be Grace Young. I've been hoping to meet you properly." She turned. The man standing beside her was tall, lean, with sandy hair and a smile that had probably been charming people since primary school. His suit fit perfectly. His eyes were the color of good coffee, and they were looking at her with open, uncomplicated admiration. "James Whitmore," he said, offering his hand. "I'm with the Chambers on Fleet Street." "I know who you are." She shook his hand. "You argued the Pemberton appeal last month. Impressive closing." His smile widened. "You watched that?" "I read the transcript. Watching would imply I have free time." He laughed, a warm, genuine sound that turned a few heads nearby. "Then let me try to earn some of that time. Can I get you a drink?" She accepted. James was easy company, witty without trying too hard, attentive without being suffocating. He asked about her work, listened when she talked about law school abroad, and told a story about his first day in court that was so perfectly timed she almost forgot why she was there. Almost, because across the ballroom, Preston Lamberton stood near the tall windows in a black suit that looked like it had been sewn onto his body, and Victoria Hale was attached to his side like ivy on a wall. Grace saw them the moment she looked up from her champagne glass. Victoria in silver, shimmering, one hand resting on Preston's forearm, while she leaned in to say something that made the people around them smile. Preston's expression was polite, distant, the face he wore in courtrooms when he was enduring something he couldn't openly reject. But from where Grace stood across a room full of people who didn't know what she knew, it looked like something else entirely. It looked like a couple. The champagne turned bitter in her mouth. She watched Victoria touch his arm again, watched her lean closer, her lips near his ear, her fingers pressing against his sleeve with a familiarity that made Grace's jaw lock so tight, her teeth ached. "He doesn't want her there," she told herself. "He said it was professional. He said he wanted you to know." But the voice in her head was quieter than the image in front of her eyes. James was still talking, something about a case, a precedent. She wasn't sure. The string quartet shifted to something with a waltz rhythm, and couples began drifting toward the dance floor. "Would you like to dance?" James asked. She looked at him. Then she looked across the room at Preston, who was nodding at something Victoria said, while his gaze swept the ballroom with the restless focus of a man searching for someone he wouldn't admit he was looking for. His eyes found her. Across the chandeliers and the crowd and the champagne flutes, his gaze landed on hers and held. She felt it in her stomach, a pull, a warning. She turned to James and smiled. "I'd love to." She let James lead her to the floor. He was a good dancer, confident, smooth, the kind of partner who made the woman look effortless. She placed her hand on his shoulder and let him guide her into the music, and she made sure, with the calm, surgical precision of a woman who knew exactly what she was doing, that they were visible from every corner of the room. She laughed at something James said, leaned closer than necessary, let her hand rest on his chest for a moment when the music paused between songs. It was a performance, she knew it, and she didn't care. Because across the ballroom, Preston Lamberton had stopped talking, stopped nodding, stopped pretending to listen to anything Victoria Hale was saying. His glass was motionless in his hand, and his face had gone still in a way that Grace had never seen before. Not the controlled stillness of the courtroom, but something rawer, something that made the air around him feel like the moment before a storm breaks. Oliver noticed. He was standing near the bar, and Grace caught his expression from the corner of her eye. Eyebrows raised, a slow, knowing smile spreading across his face as his gaze bounced between Preston, Grace, and the growing disaster unfolding on the dance floor. The song ended. James pulled back slightly, his hand still warm on her waist. "Another?" he asked. She opened her mouth to answer. A hand closed around her arm, not James's hand. Wider, stronger. Fingers that wrapped around her elbow with a grip that was firm enough to mean business and controlled enough to leave no mark. "Excuse us," Preston said. His voice was perfectly level. His eyes were not. James blinked. "Justice Lamberton, I need a word with my assessor. Legal matter." It was such a transparent lie that James almost smiled. But something in Preston's expression, a darkness behind the civility, a jaw clenched tight enough to crack walnuts, made the younger man step back. "Of course," James said. He looked at Grace. "Save me another dance?" She didn't get to answer. Preston was already moving, his hand on her arm, steering her through the crowd with the efficient determination of a man who had made a decision and would not be discussing it. They passed the bar. They passed Oliver, who raised his glass in a silent toast that neither of them saw. They passed through the French doors at the far end of the ballroom and out into the garden, where the cold night air hit Grace's bare shoulders like a slap, and the music faded to a distant murmur behind them. He let go of her arm. They were alone. Hedgerows on three sides, fairy lights strung through the branches overhead, the faint smell of roses and damp earth and the remnants of his cologne, something that made her think of firelight and the inside of a church. He turned to face her. His expression had lost every trace of the courtroom mask. What was left underneath was something she had never seen before. Not anger, not exactly. Something worse. "What the hell," he said quietly, "do you think you're doing?" Her skin burned where his hand had been. The cold air bit at her shoulders, her arms the bare skin above her collarbone, but the place where his fingers had gripped her elbow felt branded. She could still feel each one. The press of his thumb against the inside of her arm, the span of his palm, the controlled force that had steered her through a crowded room without once losing its grip. She pulled herself tall. She was shaking, and she refused to let him see it. "Dancing," she said. Her voice was steady, barely. "I was dancing. It's a gala. That's what people do." "Not like that." "Like what exactly?" His jaw tightened. She could see it even in the dim glow of the fairy lights, the muscle working beneath his skin, the effort it cost him to keep his voice low. "You know exactly what you were doing." "Enjoying myself? Having a conversation? Is that a crime now, Your Honor?" The title landed between them like a blade. She had used it on purpose to put distance where there was none, and he knew it. His eyes darkened. "Stop dancing with him." It wasn't a request. It was a command, delivered in the same voice he used from the bench. Absolute, final, expecting obedience. Grace felt something ignite in her chest, a fury so bright it erased the cold. "How would you even notice who I dance with?" she said, stepping closer. "You've been glued to Victoria Hale all evening. She's been draped over your arm like a cashmere scarf. Were you paying attention to her? Or were you too busy watching me?" a flash behind his eyes. She had hit a nerve. "What I do is none of your business, and what I do is none of yours." Silence. The music from the ballroom seeped through the walls, muffled and distant, like a heartbeat heard through water. The fairy lights swayed in a breeze that carried the scent of roses and damp stone. She turned to leave. His hand caught her arm again, firm, not rough, but immovable. "Don't walk away from me, I'm not finished." She whipped around. The fury in her was a living thing now, burning through her chest, tightening her throat, making her voice shake with something that was anger and something else she refused to examine. "Then finish, Preston. Say whatever it is you need to say, because I have somewhere to be." "Where?" She smiled. It was not a kind smile. It was the smile of a woman who had found the exact weapon she was looking for and intended to use it. "Out. With James. He asked me after the gala, and I said yes. So if you'll excuse me." It was a lie. A deliberate, calculated, vicious lie, and she watched it land on his face like a blow. Something shifted in his expression. Something raw broke through the surface, and for 1 second she saw him completely. Not the judge, not the controlled, disciplined, untouchable man who silenced barristers with a look. The man underneath. The man who was terrified and furious and desperate in equal measure. He pulled her toward him. The movement was fast and sure, closing the distance between them in one motion until her body was flush against his. She felt the heat of his chest through the thin fabric of her dress, felt the hard lines of his shoulders beneath her palms as her hands landed there by instinct. His right hand slid to the back of her neck, fingers threading into her hair, gripping the base of her skull with a pressure that was firm and possessive and made her entire body go electric. His face was inches from hers. She could feel his breath, could see the pulse hammering in his throat. "You are not leaving with him." His voice was barely a whisper, raw, unsteady. "You don't get to decide that." Her own voice was shaking now, and she hated it. "You don't get to tell me what to do." "Yes, I do." "Why?" The word came out fierce and desperate, and loaded with every unspoken thing that had been building between them for weeks, every look held too long, every accidental touch, every deliberate avoidance, the thumb on her lip, the perfume, the upside-down book, the meals from Marchetti's, the silence in the office that screamed louder than anything either of them had ever said. His thumb traced the line of her jaw, slowly, as if memorizing the shape. "Because I want it that way." "Then you'll keep wanting," she said, and her voice cracked on the last word, betraying her. "Because I don't take orders from you." He kissed her. There was no hesitation, no gentle beginning. He closed the remaining distance, and his mouth found hers with a force that stole her breath and her balance and every argument she had left. It was a kiss born from weeks of restraint. Angry and hungry and desperate, his lips pressing against hers hard enough that she felt it in her spine. She grabbed the lapels of his jacket and pulled him closer, kissing him back with the same ferocity, her teeth catching his lower lip, her fingers twisting in the fabric of his suit. His hand tightened in her hair, and she gasped against his mouth, a sound that undid something in him, because his other arm wrapped around her waist and pulled her so close that not even the night air could fit between them. He tasted like whiskey and something darker. She felt his heart slamming against her chest, felt the low sound he made in his throat when she pressed herself harder against him. His hand left her hair and traveled down the curve of her back, spreading wide across the bare skin where the dress dipped low, his fingers possessive and warm and shaking. She was drowning. The garden, the music, the cold, all of it disappeared. There was only his mouth, his hands, the weight of his body against hers, the way he kissed her like a man who had been starving and had just been given permission to eat. When they pulled apart, they were both breathing hard. Her lips felt swollen. His forehead was pressed against hers, and she could feel the tremor running through him, a full-body vibration, like a wire pulled past its limit. She opened her eyes. Over his shoulder, framed in the doorway of the French doors, James Whitmore stood perfectly still. His champagne glass was halfway to his mouth. His expression was one of quiet understanding, the look of a man who had just received an answer to a question he hadn't needed to ask. Preston followed her gaze, turned his head. He saw James, and he smiled. It was not a polite smile, it was slow and sharp and faintly predatory, the smile of a man who had planted a flag and wanted the whole world to see it. His arm was still around Grace's waist, and he made no move to release her. If anything, his hand pressed tighter against the small of her back, pulling her half an inch closer. James held the gaze for a moment. Then he raised his glass in a silent acknowledgement that held no bitterness, only the dignity of a man who knew when to leave the field. He turned and walked back inside. The door closed. The garden was quiet. Preston looked down at her. The predatory edge was gone from his face, replaced by something softer, something almost vulnerable, the expression of a man who had just thrown himself off a cliff and was still waiting to see where he would land. "Go home," he said quietly. His voice was rough like sandpaper on velvet. "What?" "Go home, Grace, straight home." She opened her mouth to argue, because arguing with him was as natural as breathing. But something in his eyes stopped her. A plea disguised as a command. A man holding himself together with both hands and asking her, without words, not to make it harder. She stepped back. His hand fell from her waist, and the cold rushed in to fill the space where his warmth had been. She walked through the garden on legs that didn't feel entirely her own. At the door she looked back. He was standing where she'd left him, hands in his pockets, face tilted toward the sky. The fairy lights made shadows across his jaw. She pressed her fingers against her lips. They were still tingling, still warm. She went home. She did not sleep. And somewhere in a garden that smelled like roses and regret, and the beginning of everything, Preston Lamberton stood alone until the last light went out. Grace arrived at the courthouse 30 minutes early. She had not slept. The mirror that morning had shown her a woman with flushed cheeks, dark circles, and a mouth that still felt different, fuller, heavier, as if the kiss had rearranged the molecules of her skin. She sat at her desk and opened the first file. The words were shapes. She read them anyway. Preston arrived at 8:15, same routine, coat, briefcase, nod. But when he passed her desk, his stride broke, a half step, barely noticeable, the kind of hesitation that only someone watching for it would catch. She was watching for it. He didn't look at her. He walked into his chambers and closed the door, and the click of the latch sounded louder than it had any right to. The morning passed in silence. No summons, no buzzing phone. "To come in." Grace worked through 2 case files, annotated a witness deposition, and drafted a motion summary with a precision that was entirely mechanical. Her hands did the work. Her mind was in a garden, tangled in fairy lights, and the taste of whiskey, and the sound of his voice saying, "Go home," like it was the hardest sentence he'd ever spoken. At 11:30, the heels announced themselves. Click, click, click. Victoria Hale rounded the corner in a cream blazer and burgundy skirt, her briefcase in one hand and a folder in the other. Her smile was wide and confident, the smile of a woman who had not seen what happened in the garden, who still believed the game was hers to play. She stopped at Grace's desk. "Good morning, is the judge available?" "I have the appellate brief he requested." Something settled inside Grace. Not anger. Something cooler. Something that sat in her chest like a stone polished smooth by weeks of watching and waiting and swallowing words she hadn't been ready to say. She was ready now. "He's reviewing files," Grace said. "I'll make sure he gets the brief." Victoria's smile didn't waver. "I'd prefer to deliver it personally. There are a few points I'd like to walk him through." Grace stood, slowly. She smoothed her blazer, squared her shoulders, and met Victoria's gaze with a calm that cost her nothing because every ounce of fear had been burned away in a garden the night before. "Victoria." She said the name the way Preston delivered a ruling. Quiet, final, leaving no room for appeal. "I appreciate your dedication to the case, but I think we both know these visits aren't entirely about appellate briefs." Victoria's smile froze. Her eyes narrowed by a fraction. Grace continued. Her voice was low enough that the corridor stayed private, firm enough that every word landed with weight. "Justice Lamberton is not available. Not for the brief, not for lunch, and not for anything that isn't on the official calendar." She paused. Let the silence do its work. "I'm sure you understand." The air between them went taut. Victoria's composure held, but something shifted behind her eyes. the quick, sharp calculation of a woman who had just been outmaneuvered and was deciding how to respond. Her gaze swept over Grace with a new intensity, searching for weakness, finding none. "That's quite a statement," Victoria said softly, "coming from an assessor." Grace didn't blink. "It's a fact, coming from someone who knows." The sentence hung in the corridor like a verdict. Victoria stared at her for a long moment. Grace held the gaze without flinching, without softening, without offering a single crack in the wall she had built in the time it took to stand up from her chair. Then Victoria straightened. Her smile returned, thinner, sharper, with an edge that hadn't been there before. She set the folder on Grace's desk with a precision that was almost aggressive. "Make sure he gets that," she said. "I will." Victoria turned and walked away. Her heels struck the marble with a rhythm that sounded different now, faster, harder, the cadence of retreat disguised as composure. Grace watched her go. She stood motionless until the sound faded, until the corridor was empty, until the only thing she could hear was her own breathing and the muffled shuffle of papers behind Preston's closed door. She sat down. Her hands were trembling. She pressed them flat against the desk and held them there until the shaking stopped. The adrenaline was draining fast, leaving behind a hollow, buzzing sensation in her chest and a fierce private pride that she would never admit to anyone. She had done it. She had drawn the line, not with a scene, not with tears, not with the kind of confrontation that would echo through the courthouse for weeks. She had done it with 6 sentences and a silence that said more than all of them combined. The folder sat on her desk. She picked it up, knocked on Preston's door, and walked in. He looked up. His face was unreadable, but his eyes moved to the folder, then to her, and something in his expression shifted, a question he didn't ask. "From Victoria Hale," Grace said. "The appellate brief." She set it on his desk and turned to leave. "Grace." She paused at the door but didn't turn around. "Was she here long?" "A beat." Grace looked over her shoulder. "Not long. I don't think she'll be coming back as often." He studied her face. She let him. Whatever he was searching for, she let him find it. The answer written in the set of her jaw, and the quiet fire behind her eyes. He nodded once, said nothing. She left. And if she smiled on the way back to her desk, a small, private, victorious smile, that no one in the corridor was there to see, that was between her and the marble walls. Whispers have a sound, not the words themselves. Those are too quiet to catch. But the sudden pause in a conversation when someone enters a room, the quick glance sideways, the smile that drops half a second too late, that sound. Grace heard it on a Wednesday morning, and it followed her through every corridor of the courthouse like a shadow she couldn't shake. It started small. A clerk who avoided her eyes at the coffee station. 2 junior barristers who stopped talking the moment she rounded the corner, their faces rearranging into expressions of exaggerated casualness. A receptionist who smiled at her with a warmth that felt new and unearned, the kind of smile people give when they think they know a secret about you. By noon, the picture was clear. She overheard it in the ladies' room. 2 solicitors, voices carrying over the sound of running water, unaware she was in the far stall. Victoria told Helen directly, said the assessor practically announced it, told her to back off because the judge was taken. And Victoria just accepted that. Victoria doesn't accept anything. She's been telling everyone who'll listen that they've been having an affair since the girl started. Says it explains everything. The late nights, the closed-door meetings, the way he promoted her caseload in the first 2 weeks. She's 24. He's... Exactly. The tap shut off. The door opened and closed. Grace stood in the stall with her back against the wall and her fists clenched at her sides. The tiles were cold behind her shoulders. She focused on that, the cold, the hard surface, something solid to press against, while the floor tilted beneath her. She had expected retaliation. Victoria was not the kind of woman who accepted defeat quietly, and Grace had known, even as she delivered those words in the corridor, that there would be a cost. But she had imagined something sharper, a formal complaint perhaps, or a quiet word with a senior judge. Not this. Not a poison poured into the building's water supply, invisible and everywhere at once. She washed her hands, dried them slowly. walked back to her desk with her chin level and her spine straight, and a fury building behind her ribs that she kept locked away where no one could see it. The afternoon was unbearable. Every interaction carried an undercurrent. A barrister she barely knew asked if she was settling in well, with a tone that implied more than the words. A senior clerk brought files to her desk and lingered, his gaze curious and not entirely professional. Even the security guard at the front entrance seemed to look at her differently, a half-smile that might have been friendly or might have been knowing. She said nothing. She did her work. She annotated 3 files, drafted 2 motions, and responded to a procedural query from the clerk's office with a level of detail that bordered on aggressive. If the courthouse wanted to talk, let them talk. She would give them nothing to confirm and everything to admire. But inside the damage was spreading, not because of the gossip itself. She had survived worse. 6 years in a foreign country had given her a thick skin and a talent for enduring judgment. What burned was the reduction. The way Victoria's version of events erased everything Grace had earned, every late night, every flawless annotation, every precedent she'd caught that seasoned lawyers had missed, and replaced it with a story where her only achievement was catching the judge's eye. That was the part that made her want to scream. She was still at her desk at 6 o'clock, long after the rest of the floor had emptied, when her phone buzzed. Oliver. Heard something interesting today. Call me when you can. She called him from the car park, standing beside her car in the amber glow of the streetlights, her breath making small clouds in the November air. Tell me, she said. Victoria Hale has been busy. Oliver's voice was calm, but there was a hardness beneath it, the sound of a man who joked about everything and was not joking now. She's telling people you and Preston are involved, that you've been sleeping together since you started, that you got the position because of your connection to me and kept it because of your connection to him. Grace closed her eyes. The streetlight hummed above her. How far has it spread? Far enough. I heard it from 2 separate people today, and neither of them work at the courthouse. Silence. The cold pressed against her face, her hands, the bare strip of skin at her wrists between her gloves and her coat. Gracie. Oliver's voice softened. What actually happened? She leaned against the car. The metal was freezing through her coat. I told her he wasn't available, that's all. And is he? Available? The question sat in the dark air between them. She could hear Oliver breathing on the other end, patient, waiting, the way he always waited when he already knew the answer and just needed her to say it. I don't know, she whispered. I don't know what we are. Oliver was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, the hardness was gone, replaced by something gentler. Then you 2 need to figure that out, fast, because the story is already written, and right now neither of you is holding the pen. She hung up, sat in the car for 10 minutes without starting the engine. Then she drove home, made tea she didn't drink, and lay on the sofa staring at the ceiling until the streetlight outside her window turned off and the room went dark. Tomorrow, Preston would hear about it. She was not ready for that conversation, but it was coming whether she was ready or not. The message appeared on her screen at 9:12 in the morning. 3 words, no greeting. My office. Now. Grace stared at the screen. Her stomach dropped the way it does on a plane when the ground suddenly isn't where it was. She had known this was coming, had spent the entire night preparing for it, rehearsing sentences in her head, building arguments the way she built legal briefs, layer by careful layer. None of that preparation survived the walk down the corridor. She knocked, didn't wait for the answer, pushed the door open and stepped inside. Preston was standing behind his desk. Not sitting, standing. His robe was draped over the chair, his suit jacket discarded, his sleeves rolled to the elbows. He looked like a man who had been pacing. The air in the room felt charged, electric, as if a storm had already passed through and left the furniture vibrating. He looked at her. Then he walked to the door, reached past her shoulder, close enough that she caught the scent of him, warm and sharp, and turned the lock. The click echoed. Sit down, he said. I'd rather stand. His jaw tightened. He moved back behind the desk, but didn't sit either. They faced each other across the mahogany surface like opposing counsel, and the distance between them felt both enormous and nowhere near enough. "I had a conversation this morning," he said. His voice was controlled, but the control was costing him. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, the tension running through his forearms. "With Judge Harrington, who heard from his clerk, who heard from 3 different barristers, that my assessor informed Victoria Hale that I was, in his words, off the market." Grace said nothing. "Victoria has been telling anyone who will listen that we are involved," he continued, "that we have been involved since you started working here, that the reason you received complex cases in your first week was not because of your competence, but because of a personal relationship with me." Each word landed like a hammer on stone, not because of his tone, which was measured, deliberate, almost clinical, but because of what lay beneath it. She could hear the anger, not at Victoria, at the situation, at the walls closing in around something he hadn't been ready to name. "Why did you say it?" he asked. "Why did you tell her I wasn't available?" The question filled the room. Grace felt the heat rise in her chest, not embarrassment, not shame. Something fiercer, something that had been building since a garden and a kiss and a man who told her to go home instead of telling her to stay. "Because she needed to hear it," Grace said. "That wasn't your call to make." "Then whose was it?" Her voice climbed. She didn't stop it. "Yours because you weren't making it. You let her come to this office 3 times a week. You let her touch your arm, lean over your desk, invite you to dinner. You never once told her to stop." "I declined every invitation." "Declining isn't the same as drawing a line, Preston, and you know that." He stared at her. The muscle in his jaw worked. She watched him fight for composure the way she'd watched him 100 times in the courtroom, except this time the case was personal, and he was losing. "You had no right," he said quietly. "You told a colleague that I was in a relationship that doesn't exist." The words hit her like cold water. She went still, completely, dangerously still. The anger in her chest shifted, hardened, became something with edges. "Doesn't exist," she repeated. He said nothing. "You kissed me." Her voice was low now, shaking with a control that was slipping fast. "In that garden, in front of James Whitmore, with your hands in my hair and your body against mine, you kissed me like the world was ending. And now you're standing there telling me it doesn't exist? That's not what I... Then what? What are we, Preston? Because I have spent weeks in this office trying to read the silences and the looks and the lunches from Marchetti's, and I am tired. I am so tired of feeling everything and understanding nothing." Her eyes were burning. She blinked hard and refused to let a single tear fall. The room was silent. The clock on the wall ticked with a patience that felt cruel. Preston stood behind his desk with his hands braced against the wood, knuckles white, head bowed. He looked like a man standing at the edge of something he had been running from for a very long time. "If you don't decide," Grace said, and her voice was steady now, steady as a blade. "Right here, right now, then I will. I will walk out of this office, and whatever this is between us becomes strictly professional. No more looks, no more lunches, no more anything." She paused. The next words tasted like gunpowder. "And I will give James Whitmore the chance he's been asking for. A real chance, not a performance." Preston's head came up. His eyes met hers. And something in them broke open. He moved like a man who had stopped thinking. 3 strides around the desk, fast, deliberate, unstoppable. His hands found her face before she could draw her next breath, palms warm against her cheeks, fingers curving behind her ears, tilting her head up to meet him. He kissed her. Not like the garden. The garden had been anger and desperation, and the collision of 2 people who had run out of ways to pretend. This was different. This was a man who had finally stopped running, and the relief of it poured through his mouth into hers, hot and shaking and so full of everything he had never said, that she felt her knees give way. She grabbed his shirt, fistfuls of white cotton, pulling him closer, feeling the buttons strain beneath her fingers. His hands slid from her face to her neck, her shoulders, the curve of her waist, drawing her against him until there was nothing between them but fabric and the furious beating of 2 hearts trying to sink. He pulled back just enough to breathe, his forehead pressed against hers. His eyes were open, dark, stripped of every wall he had ever built. "You." His voice was wrecked. "It has always been you. Since the yacht." Since the steam and the towel and the look on your face when you realized I was there, I have not been able to think straight since that night, and I am done pretending otherwise." She made a sound, half laugh, half sob, and kissed him again. His hands found the zipper at the back of her skirt. He paused, looked at her. A question in his eyes that had nothing to do with authority or control. Just a man asking permission from the only person whose answer mattered. She answered by pulling his shirt free from his trousers. What followed was not graceful. It was urgent and clumsy and real, his elbow knocking a stack of files off the desk, her back against the cool wood, his mouth on her collarbone, her fingers raking through his hair. The room smelled of old books and his cologne and the warmth of two bodies finding each other for the first time, and every sound she made undid him a little more. He was gentle where it mattered. His hands, so steady in the courtroom, trembled when they touched the bare skin of her stomach. He traced the line of her ribs with a reverence that made her breath catch, not from desire alone, but from the tenderness woven through it. He kissed the inside of her wrist, the hollow of her throat, the place behind her ear where her pulse hammered against his lips. She pulled him closer, wrapped herself around him. And when they finally came together, the sound she made was quiet, almost a whisper, and he pressed his mouth against her shoulder and held her like she was the only solid thing in a world that had just tilted on its axis. It was intense, fierce, overwhelming. The kind of first time that burns away pretense and leaves two people more exposed than skin alone could ever manage. Every wall they had built, the professionalism, the restraint, the careful distance, crumbled and left nothing standing but the truth of what they were. Afterwards they stayed where they were. His forehead rested against her shoulder. Her fingers moved through his hair in slow, absent strokes. Their breathing settled together, falling into the same rhythm without either of them trying. The office was a disaster. Files on the floor. His chair pushed against the wall. A pen had rolled under the bookshelf. The late morning light came through the windows at a low angle and painted gold stripes across the carpet, across his back, across her hand resting on his neck. He lifted his head. His eyes found hers. She had never seen him look like this, open, unguarded. The lines of control that defined his face had softened, and what remained was something younger, something almost boyish, the face of a man who had just discovered that the thing he feared most was also the thing he wanted most, and that they were the same. "Be with me," he said. His voice was quiet, steady, certain. Not in secret, not behind closed doors. "Be with me, Grace." Officially. Her eyes filled. She tried to blink it away and couldn't. A tear slipped down her cheek and he caught it with his thumb. The same thumb that had once freed her lip from between her teeth, now tracing the curve of her cheekbone with a gentleness that made her chest ache. "Yes," she said. He smiled. It was a rare thing, Preston Lamberton's real smile. Not the courtroom smile, not the polite one he gave colleagues. This one started slow, cracked open his whole face, and transformed him so completely that Grace felt her heart stutter. She reached up and touched the corner of his mouth, as if to make sure it was real. "Yes," she said again, and kissed him softly. They stayed in that office for a long time. Not because they needed to, because, for the first time, neither of them wanted to be anywhere else. Oliver laughed so hard he knocked his whiskey off the table. The glass hit the carpet with a muffled thud, ice cubes scattering like startled mice, and he didn't even glance at it. He was doubled over in his chair at the club, one hand on his stomach, tears forming at the corners of his eyes, making sounds that weren't quite words yet. Preston sat across from him, perfectly still, watching his best friend lose control of his entire body. "Are you finished?" Preston asked. Not even close," Oliver gasped, then dissolved again. A waiter approached, saw the state of him, and quietly retreated. It took 3 full minutes. When Oliver finally straightened up, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand, his grin was enormous and entirely unsurprised. "I knew it," he said. "I knew it the night of my birthday. You came back from that corridor looking like you'd been hit by a bus, and Gracie switched rooms without explaining why, and you both spent the rest of the weekend avoiding each other like teenagers at a school dance." Preston said nothing. His expression was neutral, but there was a warmth behind it that Oliver had never seen before. Something settled, something that had stopped fighting. "She's my cousin," Oliver said, and the grin softened into something more serious. "You know that means I'll have to be insufferable about this." "I'm counting on it." Oliver leaned forward. The humor faded, and what was left was the other side of him. The loyal side, the side that had once broken off a business deal because the other party had insulted Preston's integrity at a dinner. "Make her happy," he said, "or I'll make your life very uncomfortable." "Noted." Oliver picked up the overturned glass, set it on the table, and signaled for 2 more whiskies. "Now, tell me everything. Start from the yacht. Don't skip a single detail." Preston told him almost everything. He skipped certain details that were none of Oliver's business, and never would be, but he told him enough. The tension, the lip, the garden, the office. He told him about the way Grace argued with him like no one else dared, about the lunches from Marchetti's, about the look on Victoria Hale's face when the courthouse realized the rumor was true, except it wasn't a scandal. It was simply a fact, stated without apology. He had told his colleagues himself. No announcement, no explanation. He had simply introduced Grace at a judicial dinner as his partner, his hand resting on the small of her back with a naturalness that left no room for questions. The months that followed were nothing like Preston had expected. He had spent his adult life in the company of silence and order, and Grace was neither silent nor orderly. She left shoes in the hallway. She sang in the shower, badly, with commitment. She argued with him about case law over breakfast and about what to watch on television over dinner, and she won both arguments more often than he would ever admit. They fought. Properly, loudly, with the same intensity they brought to everything else. She accused him of being impossible. He accused her of being stubborn. She threw a cushion at him once during a disagreement about holiday plans, and he caught it one-handed, without breaking eye contact, and they both started laughing at the same time and couldn't stop for 5 minutes. He discovered the note on a Thursday. He had been looking for a pen in his desk drawer when his fingers touched a folded piece of paper tucked beneath a stack of envelopes. He opened it and recognized her handwriting, neat, slightly slanted, with the kind of loops that suggested she'd learned penmanship from someone who cared about it. "For the record, that suite was mine first, and the towel was entirely insufficient. Consider this my formal complaint, Your Honor." He read it twice, 3 times. A laugh escaped him, sudden, unguarded, the kind only she could pull from him. He pressed the note flat against the desk and stared at it with a tenderness that would have shocked every barrister who had ever stood trembling before his bench. He folded it carefully and put it back in the drawer. He smiled every time he opened it. Every single time. And on the days when the caseload was heavy and the courtroom felt cold, he would slide the drawer open, just an inch, and remember that somewhere down the corridor sat a woman who could make him laugh with a piece of paper and a memory of steam. That, he decided, was worth every rule he had ever broken. The kitchen smelled like garlic and rosemary, and the particular warmth of a home that had been lived in properly. Not decorated for show, but filled with the evidence of 2 people building something real. A coat thrown over a chair, a stack of case files on the counter next to a half-empty bottle of wine. Her shoes by the door kicked off the moment she walked in, because Grace Young did not believe in wearing heels 1 second longer than absolutely necessary. It was a Tuesday. Nothing special about it. Rain against the windows, a pot simmering on the stove, the sound of Preston moving through the living room while she set the table. They had been together for 8 months, and the rhythm of their evenings had become a language of its own, quiet, easy, punctuated by small exchanges that carried more weight than either of them showed. "The Henderson ruling came back today," she said, folding a napkin. "Upheld on all counts." "I know. I read it before lunch. You could at least pretend to be impressed. I could, but then you'd know I was pretending and you'd hold it against me." She smiled. He knew her so well it was almost annoying. Dinner was simple. Pasta, salad, bread he'd picked up from the bakery near the courthouse, because she had once mentioned, months ago, that their sourdough reminded her of a place she used to visit during law school. He had remembered. He always remembered. It was his way of saying the things he still found difficult to put into words, the steady, quiet devotion that showed up not in grand gestures, but in a loaf of bread on a rainy Tuesday. They ate. They talked about work, about Oliver's latest business venture, about the weekend trip they were planning to the coast. She told him about a junior barrister who had cited the wrong statute in open court and then tried to argue it was intentional. He almost choked on his wine. After dinner, she carried the plates to the sink. He told her to leave them. She ignored him because she always ignored him when he tried to stop her from doing things, and this had become one of their favorite small battles, an endless, gentle war of stubbornness that neither of them wanted to win. She was rinsing a glass when she heard him stand up from the sofa, the creak of the cushion, the soft sound of his shoes on the floor. She turned around, drying her hands on a tea towel. He was on one knee. The air left her body. He knelt in the middle of the living room between the coffee table and the bookshelf, holding a small velvet box in hands that, for the first time in all the months she had known him, were shaking. Grace. Her hands flew to her mouth. The tea towel fell to the floor. "I am not a man who makes speeches," he said. His voice was rough, unsteady, nothing like the voice that commanded courtrooms. "I don't have the right words for this. I'm not sure the right words exist, but I know that before you walked into my life, this house was just rooms, and now it's, He paused, swallowed. "It's everything. You made it everything." She was already crying. She didn't care. "Yes," she said. He blinked. "I haven't asked yet." "Then hurry up." He laughed. A real laugh, the kind that only she could pull from him, and it broke the trembling in his hands and the tightness in his chest. "Marry me, Grace. Please." She crossed the room in 3 steps, pulled his face up with both hands and kissed him with tears running down her cheeks, and a smile so wide it made the kiss clumsy and perfect. "Yes," she whispered against his mouth. 1,000 times. He slipped the ring onto her finger. His hands were still shaking. She held them between hers until they were still. The kitchen smelled like roasted chicken and the particular chaos of a family learning its own shape. Preston stood at the counter with his son balanced on one hip, a boy with dark eyes and his mother's stubborn chin, trying to serve dinner with his free hand while the baby grabbed for his collar. Grace sat at the table, 5 months along now, her hand resting on the curve of her belly beneath a soft knit dress. She watched him struggle with the plates and the baby and the serving spoon, and she laughed, the kind of laugh that filled every corner of the kitchen and made the room feel twice as warm. "You're worse than any judge in a hearing," she said. He set her plate down, cut the baby's food into careful pieces, retrieved the extra cushion for her back from the living room and placed it behind her with the focused precision of a man handling the most important task of his career. "With you," he said, sitting down across from her with the boy now settled in the high chair between them. "The sentence is life." She rolled her eyes, but she smiled. He reached across the table and took her hand. The baby banged a spoon against the tray. The rain tapped at the window, and Preston Lamberton, the most feared judge in the region, the man who had once silenced an entire courtroom with a single look, smiled the way he only smiled when he was home. Like a man who had been found guilty of happiness and had no interest in an appeal. Leave your comment and share this story with someone special. It truly helps us keep bringing new stories to you. And if you want to follow every chapter of this emotional journey, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell. Your support makes all the difference.